Hi, Krista. Today we have the pleasure to be with you, and we are really looking forward to hear about your paper. Let me introduce you and say a few words about you. Christa Van Raalte is Associate Professor in Film and Television and Head of the Center for Excellence in Media Practice at Bournemouth University. Her research addresses the experience of working in the television industry, including career development, retention, and the leaky talent pipeline, management practices, workplace bullying, and media education. She has published these themes in academic journals as well as in industry-facing reports. Dr. Van Raalte also publishes on representations of gender and on narrative strategies in film and television text. Most recent publication is the paper that we are discussing today, The Good Manager in TV, Tales from the 21st Century. Another paper is Where Have All the PMs Gone? Addressing the production management skills gap in UK TV. Another one is Britain's Got Talent, a critique of the talent pipeline crisis in the UK film and television industries. More than just a few bad apples, the need for a risk management approach to the problem of workplace bullying in the UK television industry. And State of Play 2021, Management Practices in UK Under Script Television. The Poetics of Obsession, Understanding Catherine Bigelow's Characters, and Reflection on Mortality, the Imagery of Mirrors in Clint Eastwood Gran Torino. So, Krista, we are very glad to have you here. I'm giving you the floor to tell us a little bit about your paper.
Okay, thanks, Susan. I'll just organize this sharing screen thing. I think that is right. And yes. Is that the front? Can you see that? Yes. Okay. Okay. So important to say, first of all, that I'm presenting this paper on behalf of myself and Dr. Richard Wallace, with whom I collaborate on a number of projects, and most of my work around work in television film has been done in collaboration with Richard. And a little bit of background on this paper. Its genesis actually starts from the Stage Play Report, which was a big study that we did for Beck2 around these themes, and that then sort of morphed into a couple of different publications. So to commence. So employment conditions in the British television industry have become the focus of attention of late for academics as well as industry leaders and support organisations that exist within the sector. The modern industry is characterised by largely casualised freelance workforce, excessively long hours, informal hiring and working practices that often skirt the margins of legal compliance. And while the work can afford great satisfaction, the work experience is too often marked by toxic work cultures, bullying and burnout, resulting in poor mental health outcomes for workers and skills deficits for the industry as it fails to retain experienced staff. A survey of some 1,200 television professionals that we carried out in 2021 for Beck2, the Television Union, indicated a steadily worsening situation in this respect, as commissioners require increasingly ambitious products for increasingly squeezed budgets, often on nigh impossible timescales. Here we go. Ugh. As countless studies in organizational psychology have demonstrated, good management is a key factor in job satisfaction for employees across myriad sectors, and our research suggests that television is no exception. So for this project, we interviewed 22 individuals, actually individuals who had completed that original survey. And they were individuals who had some form of management responsibility, mostly series producers and heads of production. These are really the people in any other industry would be considered middle managers. And we asked them what it meant to be a good people manager in their view, what challenges they faced, and how those challenges could be addressed across a sector that is so volatile and so rapidly developing. And we borrowed the title of this paper from Brecht's parable play, The Good Person Sets One, in which the generous-hearted heroine, Shente, finds it almost impossible to survive as a good person in a society that does not value or encourage goodness. It is our contention that would-be good managers in TV often find themselves in a similar predicament. So, good management has been shown to be critical in the job demand resource model that looks for a balance between the demands a job makes and the resources available to the worker in terms of their ultimate well-being. So while individual workers, of course, bring resources to their roles from outside the workplace, whether personal or family or whatever, workplace resources are also critical, and key among these, possibly the most important, is a positive relationship with one's manager, with, in second place, quite closely in most cases, a social engagement with peers, and social support from peers is itself correlated with good management practices. So basically, good management impacts both directly and indirectly on the workplace resources that people bring to their roles. Good management is shown to boost what are called challenge demands, mostly the things that make a job worth doing, that bring job satisfaction, and also to buffer what are called hindrance demands, basically the kind of job demands that annoy people. Conversely, what Skogstad and Einarsson term destructive practices, destructive management practices, are correlated with poor outcomes. This is equally the case whether those are actively negative practices, such as tyrannical leadership, or passively negative practices, such as laissez-faire and neglectful leadership. On the whole, researchers agree that what we mean by good management in this respect is what's often termed transformational management, which is positively correlated with workers' psychological well-being and negative correlated with burnout and bullying. And it should be noted that there are no, well, as far as I'm aware, there are no empirical studies focused on the creative industries or any industry quite so dominated by short freelance contracts in this literature, probably because it's quite difficult to do. But there are parallels in terms of vocational professions, such as teaching or nursing, where money is clearly not the primary driver. And it's also the case that short-term agency staff in those areas have been found to be especially motivated by transformational strategies, such as constructive feedback, as opposed to more transactional approaches. And just for people who are not familiar, the main dimensions of transformational management are a sort of a positive, value-led role model, communication of a positive vision and motivation, encouraging initiative and creative engagement with work, and giving consideration to the needs of the individuals within a team. Unfortunately, there are a number of obstacles to this kind of good management in TV, and these fall into three broad and overlapping categories. First of all, identity. Most television folk do not see themselves as managers, including the people we were talking to. Successful creatives are promoted to these positions on the basis of their creative successes, often with no meaningful preparation and often with no interest in anything other than the creative outcomes and possibly the budget, which are the criteria on which their next job depends. Management training, such as it is, has until recently been practically non-existent, unless you happen to work for the BBC, which is not most people, or inaccessible to freelancers who generally have to fund their own training and undertake it in unpaid time, and therefore are unlikely to engage unless they see clear career benefits. Employers, meanwhile, are hiring most of their managers on short-term contracts and have no reason to invest in expensive training for them. It's also the case that where training does exist, it can be quite challenging to find a balance between relevance and exceptionalism. There are differences in how things are done. You can't just transport management training from other sectors into television, but at the same time, it's not the case that it is so exceptional that, none of the same principles apply. And these two factors reflect some of the structural and cultural context. Structurally, managers are saddled with increasingly ambitious production briefs and ever-shrinking production budgets, so they feel they've neither the time nor the resources to engage with their team's welfare. While workers on precarious contracts are not in a position to complain, culturally, the ideology of exceptionalism is used to justify a working environment that would be deemed unacceptable in a supermarket, for example. It's different because it's telly, it's just the way the industry works, you're lucky to have a job. Without training, managers are dependent on role models that may lead them to replicate bad practice, underpinned by a sense that they will win no brownie points for good practice in the industry that does not value management skills. Again, no one can be good for long if goodness is not in demand. So these more structural logistical issues and the cultural issues are quite well illustrated, I think, by these quotes from our interviews. If you accept the job, it's now your responsibility to make this happen, even if everyone knows it's not possible. So, and that does happen a lot, I'd say, your job is to kind of convince other people to be on your team, and then they've been given some of the responsibility for this unachievable goal. And then you get cross with them because it's not possible, and your own boss is cross with you. And that's how it all goes horribly wrong. And then this other one about creative exceptionalism. TV can feel a bit like the Wild West. It's largely unregulated. And as far as I'm aware, I've never worked for a company that's had any sort of clear understanding of its values. What are the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behaviour? There's a sort of historic cultural issue, which is eccentric behaviour is tolerated to a greater degree. This assumption that if you're a creative person, you're going to be versatile, you're going to be eccentric, you're not going to abide by normal society rules. I think it's nonsense, this person says. So, to sort of look in a bit more detail at some of these logical and cultural obstacles to good practice, our respondents identified these specific challenges. They found it impossible to clearly communicate goals to their teams when they were getting mixed messages from above. They struggled to give regular constructive feedback due to time constraints, but also due to a limited understanding of what that might look like, as they'd never experienced it themselves. Lack of expertise as managers was also an issue when trying to support individuals, for example, under equal opportunities legislation, where they may have no knowledge of it, or even that such legislation exists in some cases. But even in areas where managers were more confident, they sometimes found their attempts to show consideration for their teams were thwarted by their own superiors. We were told a story by one manager who felt, and this is very common, the team were being expected to drive maybe 300 miles back to London after sort of 3 18-hour days on the trot, and that it wasn't appropriate and they should be put up overnight. And basically got a very, very firm cease and desist order from the company saying you absolutely under no circumstances may use the budget this way, make them drive home. Fair and open recruitment was also logistically impossible on a lot of factual productions that were greenlit, in other words, got the go-ahead from the commissioner at the very last minute with just days to crew up, which means that the manager has to actually get people on board with that team within maybe even 3 days, as little time as that. But at the same time, a culture that supported a policy of hiring who you know, which is how it's done, made it difficult to push back, even where managers were minded to do so. And then once hired, there was no room to work developmentally with team members, given the combination of ever shorter contracts and production pressures that required everyone to hit the ground running. Meanwhile, frazzled managers felt they had neither the time nor the expertise to engage in the kinds of timely conflict resolution within their teams that Agotni's and others flag as critical to avoiding bullying and the development of toxic work cultures. And finally, performance management. There's a wonderful quotation in the State of Play report about nobody understands performance management in this industry. Performance management was conspicuous by its absence. A lack of capacity, again, in terms of either time or expertise, meant for the most part managers would find ways just to work around poor performance, often giving other already hard-worked individuals more to do, until the end of that individual's contract, and simply not renew or not rehire them. And the individual in question is kept completely in the dark as to why they didn't get another job. In effect, the structural and cultural context in which our respondents works militates against good management practices and positively encourages destructive practices. Between the highly stressful nature of running a production and the negative norms of the industry, good management practices do seem to be the exception. And again, industry cultures appear to place little or no value on good management of the people it relies on for its success. And as we know, according to Brecht, no one can be good for long if goodness is not in demand. And the people who work in television are on the whole a positive lot. And our respondents often express some optimism about future change. And indeed, there is an increasing recognition of the needs for management training across the industry. And there is a new project underway even now to support better management in the industry. But even the best trained managers and those most highly attuned to workers' needs can only do so much in the face of this impossible brief and this ideology that supports unhealthy work cultures. We argue, therefore, in our article that there is a clear need for structural and cultural change across the industry in the interest of maintaining a skilled, motivated, healthy workforce. And so, some illustration of that, this individual says, I think people are more aware now, certainly with things like GDP, and I think with discrimination laws and things being more at the forefront of people's minds, I think they're more willing to put money behind HR and training for management. And a certain amount of faith. I think people can make a difference, you can make small differences, and lots of small differences can end up being a big difference. But none of these sort of expressions of faith really amount to the kind of cultural and structural change required to normalize good management in TV. And I think that is the end of my presentation. I think that ran much faster than I expected it to. There we go.
Oh, thanks very much, Christa. Thanks very much. Vivian, you're going to manage this next section, I believe. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Muted. I do realize I could have unpacked some of those things a little more for a non-specialist audience, but I thought that I would be short on time.
Well, hopefully there'll be some questions
Yes,
and we can unpack some things a bit more.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk and very insightful. And I would like to ask if anybody would like to make a question, and we can also follow. Yes, Professor Rougoulis.
Yeah. Irena.
Irena, yeah. Right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christa. Really interesting study and really interesting results. I was wondering, because you said your informants didn't call themselves managers,
yeah.
And I was trying to guess what role they were,
They were
whether it made a difference.
they were almost all. I think they were all series producers,
Yeah,
or production execs. Yeah. So that we very much we asked people when we did the stage play survey, which was 1,200 people. One of the questions we asked was, we asked if people were in what might be called a management role, if they had any management responsibility for people. And we asked those people who answered yes to that, whether they'd ever had any training, which you can probably imagine the sort of results to that. But we also asked people if they were willing to take part in any follow-up research, as one often does. And then we went through quite carefully and looked at the senior or the sort of middle management roles within it. And those were the people we approached for the interviews. So, and it was pretty much half and half editorial and production.
Did it matter how long the productions were? Because, you know, I can imagine 3-day shoot, you're going to just you live with it, you never hire them again. If you've got a series, or if you're something like you know, sort of one of the high-end TV dramas, and you're there for months, does that make a difference? Does that make them more likely to do something along the lines of performance management?
I would say a little bit, but I also have to say this study was done with people working unscripted.
Right.
And there's relatively little unscripted that operates that way. There are big productions like Blue Planet, which keep the same team on for quite a long time. But on the whole, you are talking about some quite short shoots and short contracts. And we haven't looked in huge detail at the drama end, not in a study like this, more so in sort of more interview-based stuff. One gets a fairly clear sense that things are not as bad in drama, but even so, something like performance management, nobody knows how to do that. It's, you know, and again, even in drama, there's very rarely any feedback. People never get told how they're doing. My colleague, who's a co-author on this, he's actually currently on a innovation fellowship at Fremantle, and he's piloting a supportive offboarding scheme, which is like little exit interviews for people. And part of that is getting their feedback about their experience, and also sharing with them some feedback from colleagues and so forth, and talking about their sort of career trajectory, I suppose. This is terribly innovative. If you're in telly, the idea that somebody might have a conversation with you about your careers. When you talk to people, they'll say, "Oh, I hired a career coach." That's the nearest they've ever got to that. So the whole idea that you would get performance management is a very far cry. You know, it's not professionalized that way. You know, the management isn't professionalized that way. Yeah. So yeah.
Right, Claire has asked a question in the chat box. If I can just ask this on her behalf, unless Claire, oh, would you like to ask that yourself, Claire? Sorry, I thought, yeah, Claire obviously can. No, I'm not sure. Sorry, that was my hand. Right, so Claire says thanks very much for your interesting talk, and she's actually interviewing healthcare workers at the moment, and they've got a similar idea about exceptionality, about their working conditions, and often decide that having meaningful work that means that it's understandable that they can't be paid as well or developed as quickly. And she wonders if there were ideas of having meaningful creative work that left your respondents feeling similarly.
Yes, I mean, it has to be said that in all of the work that we've done, talking to people about their working experiences, they always have a lot positive to say. And we tend to begin with that as well. You know, people enjoy a lot about what they do. They, you know, they do find it meaningful. They do find a slightly different way from health workers, I think, but they find, you know, they find a lot to enjoy, and they enjoy the creative process. And then it becomes a balance, because this issue of the sort of brain drain from the sector, it's a balance, as I suppose it is with healthcare as well, which is, to what extent is that enough to make up for the other stuff? We just did a more recently a study that looked at particularly about production managers, because there's a huge problem with retaining production managers, and their biggest issue is just not being appreciated. They just feel it's huge. They feel that nobody understands what it is they do. Nobody understands, you know, the nature of their contribution. They have, all of them have got a story of somebody saying to them, oh, you just booked the taxis or something. That nobody ever thanks them for efforts. Everybody blames them for absolutely everything that goes wrong, regardless of whether it's anything to do with their job or not. And it's not the only factor, but it's the biggest consistent factor in why they go. Of course, there's other stuff, but it's like, not only can I never see my children, not only am I not very well paid, but on top of all of that, nobody thinks. So again, it's this idea of, and they enjoy it up to a point, but there's a point at which they just know this is just too much, and it's just not worth the candle. And I think that's the issue. That's where they lose people, the degree to which people are prepared to put up with it.
Yeah, I'm just going to shoot myself. Connected. I really enjoyed the paper, and I was really struck by, we discussed this before the meeting actually, about the precarity in this prestigious, quite competitive industry, very hard to access, and we typically associate it with, you know, kind of upper middle class people, you know, getting into the industry, but this lack of well-being, it's not really something that I've thought about in this industry, this lack of control and burnout. So I'm really interested in, like, who stays, who leaves, what strategies do you see people employing?
I think, well, it's this issue of who's in the industry. I think time and again one sees a lot of emphasis on other social groups, if you like, other than the very obvious privileged groups who do make up a very large portion of the industry. One sees a lot of emphasis on who gets in, and you know, quite rightly in some cases, but there's also who stays in, and that's something we've seen a lot. If you look at who is on a crew, all the way down to the lower positions, you'll see much more, say, for example, ethnic diversity, until you start looking at more senior positions. And that's not just because of who gets promoted, it's just who manages to hang on. Because there's a lot of people start and leave. So there's questions about resilience here. How much of this can you put up with? And we're not talking about personal resilience in a sense that some people just can't cope or something. If you're already if you do not have independent financial resources, if you do have caring responsibilities, you know, if you're already dealing with, say, some form of disability, you know, if you've got anything else going on, the chances that you're going to manage to make it through this sort of baptism of fire of sort of 18-hour days and, you know, never getting any feedback and so on and so forth, you know, so there is a question about, yeah, how many of these balls you can juggle, how resilient can you be, is it still jobs for the boys? Irene, I think it's the name of one of your articles, isn't it? You know, and I do think that, yeah, that's a factor. You know, there's certain personalities, I think, that will put up with more of this, but an awful lot of it is to do with people's other life circumstances, and people who are in relatively privileged positions, relatively cushioned positions in one way and another, whether that's to do with finances, it often is, or to do with other sort of resources they're bringing to the table, back to that resource demand sort of model. If they've got these other resources, as it were, going for them, maybe they can keep going. The minute you have a child, for example, if you're a woman, not if you're a man, when you have a child, this is just one thing too many. you know. So I think that's a big factor. Yeah, hence the issue we have talking about diversity. You know, there are many diversity initiatives, but while it is almost impossible for anyone to stay in this business without that cushioning. You've got a question, Vivian?
Yes. Yes, I would like to ask you, if we were going back to the 1990s, where we witnessed the big shift to the service sectors. At that time, I thought that, let's say, TV sector, it was better in people's mind because the salaries were very high. There was extremely benefits for the people working in there. And now we have a shift, especially after crisis or the multiple crises, the successive ones we had. So to what extent this kind of change of the overall socioeconomic context have impact not only the working condition inside, but the people's perception, both the managers and the people working inside? Because we have this very big change from the very wealthy sector at the time of the 90s. Today, which is everything is going, has a working workplace quite turbulent.
Gosh, I think there's quite a lot of answers to that. One thing that happened in the 90s, of course, well, it happened before the 90s, but it really started to take off in the 90s, was the increased casualization of the industry. And that came with the rise of the indies, you know, the deregulation, which actually starts to happen sooner. But you know, if you go back to the 70s, everybody's in a union and everybody's got some protection, right? It's a different, and people have actual jobs where people pay them all the time. Whereas, you know, gradually with sort of Thatcher's deregulation, and then more and more emphasis on the indies, on the independent production companies who don't employ anyone permanently, you know. And now this is becoming even more emphasized. So even sort of ITV studios, BBC studios are using fewer and fewer staff contracts. You know, they're losing staff contracts. So you've got this increased casualization, increase. So that changes the tone, because this precarity, this sort of hangs over everybody, obviously becomes more prevalent. I mean, it was always an element of it, and it was also much more of it in film, but in television that wasn't so much the case. So that obviously, I mean, I think, you know, you can't underestimate how important precarity and project work is, because everybody is constantly auditioning for their next job. Makes it very, very difficult to protest about anything, to complain about anything, even to question, do we really need to work 18 hours on Saturday? Really? You know, because you might not get the next job. So that is a major, major factor in here. And your manager's on the same contract. So I think that is a big sort of overarching context. There are other factors about how things are financed. And just before COVID, there was a big injection of cash from the streamers. And we did have a sort of real glut period with people like Netflix putting quite a lot of money into productions, but they've started pulling it back. You know, and one of the things that people complain about, and this is quite interesting, people say, well, you know, there have been great benefits that come from the streamers, you know, huge injections of cash coming into the European and particularly the British market. I mean, that was the headline just before COVID. But on the other hand, they say, do you know, commissioners look at these glitzy Netflix shows and say, well, we want something like that, and here's half the money. Please do that. And this is the financial pressures become more increasing, also because of advertising. There's less advertising going online, there's less money in their business, you know. So in those sort of overarching contextual things, the sort of splitting of audiences. So streaming brings money, but it also takes audiences away. So then it reduces the advertising spend. And so, yeah, so particularly unscripted, there's an awful lot of stuff being made on an absolute shoestring. And what that actually means is, here is the budget for something that needs, you know, really 4 weeks edit, but let's give it a 3-week edit and everyone can work all night for the same money, is broadly the logic. You know, I simplify, but you know, or we won't have production coordinator, we'll just have production manager and they can do it all themselves. That's the sort of thing that makes that's what creates those really high pressure environments, because of the impossible task. I mean, that quote about the impossible task came up a lot. You know, we have just agreed to do X for Y money, where Y doesn't even remotely equal X. And everybody's going to pretend it can be done and just work mad hours to do it, because we have to make it and we have to get the quality, despite the fact we haven't been funded to do so. It's about money at the end of the day.
That's a huge well-being issue, though, isn't it? And like you say, certain people just can't thrive in that environment.
No. Most people can't thrive. You know, so it's quite interesting. You talk to people who are very, you know, well placed within this industry, quite senior, quite experienced, you know, well known, and they're also really struggling. It's a question of, you know, none of them can keep a marriage together, for starters. You know, film and television charities now very interested in this idea of loneliness as a factor within the terrible mental health outcomes in the industry. And so, well, it turns out that a lot of it's about, you know, loneliness, and we're looking at, and that might be a function of people being project workers, so they're not sort of forming long-term relationships in the workplace. But, you know, one of the things that we point out to them is, yeah, but then also not maintaining long-term relationships outside the workplace, because there's no chance to form them or keep them, because of the kind of pressures. One of the very, very common story you get, it's one of those ones that comes up again and again and again, is, you know, I lose friends because I never turn up for things that we're supposed to be doing. I never made to my best friend's wedding. I never made to anybody's wedding. So talking about people in their 30s here, probably mainly, but you know, this story of never making to the best friend's wedding, it's just one of those sort of tropes that keeps turning up again and again. So people become quite isolated. All their friends are in telly because nobody else understands. A spouse is in telly, that doesn't work because that's deeply impractical most of the time. You know, it's not ideal for people's lives on the whole.
Is there also an issue with the forced cheerfulness? And I think it's a challenge to us as researchers, because
100%.
these are people who can't complain, because if they complain, they won't get the next job.
Yes.
So everything is lovely and every manager is fabulous.
Yeah.
And it must be, you know, speaking as a grumpy professor, it must be a great strain.
Oh yeah, totally. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's a massive factor, actually. Really is a massive factor. And we've got quite good at no, it really is anonymous, and these are all the protections you really can talk. You know, the number of people you actually do a long interview, and every single one of them comes off feeling like they come off the therapist's couch because they'll say, I haven't said this to anyone. That's very common. I haven't said this to anyone, because you can't. And I had a really interesting discussion with one manager who said, I do say to people, you know, again, back to I'm trying to be a good manager, I do say to people, you know, we do tell me if there's an issue. She says, nobody ever does, because they're not going to, because what you just said, they're going to be positive. Everybody's positive. Everything's marvelous. How are you doing? I'm doing marvelously. Everything's under control. If it's not, they'll just work till 2 and it's. They're not going to say, well, actually, I'm really struggling with X, because then they're marking their card. They don't get the next gig. Well, that's how they see it. And it doesn't matter that this well-intentioned manager has said to them, no, honestly, tell me if you're having a problem and I'll, you know, no, they're not going to tell them. You're absolutely right. The positivity. Yeah, everybody's very upbeat and very positive about everything. Until they crack.
To you know, you're invoking you know, the good manager. Were people changing that, saying, well, nobody's coming forward and saying there's anything wrong, it's clearly not needed here, not valued, and then they're changing. Obviously, people are dynamic, aren't they? You know, you're going to be influenced. Were people admitting that they'd changed for the worst, for instance?
What, as individuals, do you mean?
As in people in your interviews, yeah, that they had changed and they'd just given up on trying to be the good manager.
Don't think I had anyone say they'd given up trying. Did have people saying, I can't do it because I'm not allowed to. That example about the trying to get people a hotel and getting the email that said, under no circumstances should you do this and make them drive. You know, that sort of thing, feeling it was quite, they would stick their necks out. There were those who would stick their necks out for their crew and get into trouble for it. But they had to be pretty careful about that, right? Because again, they want to work. So had people say it's very difficult to do, had people say, I don't know what the hell I'm doing because I've never had any training to make it up, I'm probably doing it wrong. Didn't have anyone say I've given up trying. Again, I don't think that's a very telly thing. You know, and of course you get those who say, oh, it's all absolutely fine. You listen to what they're saying and you think, not sure, you know. I mean, the changes that management is being talked about, there is quite a bit of management training knocking about now. Their Screen Skills is running free some small training programs, but it's still not the majority of people, and it's still not the sort of discourse of the industry. Is still in that kind of, you're lucky to have a job, and you know, when I were a lad I had to go through this, those sorts of things. Yeah. Still a lot of that.
I mean, I can see you've got, you know, recommendations that you've made. How optimistic are you? Not very, I guess, about the...
Well, you know, the BSI has got its Good Work programme, which is actually all about management, which I think in itself is quite interesting. It sort of spins off the back of the Good Work Review, which is a more creative industries in general, big policy evidence people did this big sort of review, but the way that the BFI has put that into practice, or chosen to put that into practice in the screen indices, is with an emphasis on management. Not much management training, much more management resources. I mean, what they're trying to do is suggest that people might like to, you know, obey the law, for example. That would be nice. And they're hoping to sort of, I think they've rather given up on the idea of goodwill in this, and are trying to sort of point out to people that the ways in which they're employing people, you know, people who work on contracts and without a contract for most of their period before they ever see a bit of paper, and when they do, it doesn't say anything resembling what they're actually doing. That's very common. People play fast and loose with the concept of self-employment quite a lot. There's all sorts of, you know, issues. Like I say, the idea that there might be some legislation around equality of opportunity is a massive shock to some people. You know, it's so there's quite a lot of provision being put in place to try and support that.
But it is provision targeted. I mean, the danger of training is it's an easy solution that blames no one, and it doesn't touch the structural issues. And it's, you know, this isn't limited to film and TV production. This is more broadly, but there is a great danger that you come up with these wonderful conclusions that it is a structural issue, it is a cultural issue. You need to employ people differently, and all that is completely ignored. Because that's built in, and we can also train people. Great, let's train people, because that way we can blame the individual managers.
Yes, we can take the fault. Yes, I know. I mean, exactly, and that's why we sort of said, look, you know, it would be helpful to have training, but it won't fix the overall context. If it is the context that makes it very difficult to be a good manager, and you know, that it's difficult, you know, because we work a lot with people in the industry. We do a lot of sort of industry-facing reports as well as sort of academic papers, and in the industry, paper-facing reports, you've got to be positive. So you're sort of saying, well, okay, it would be great if people did have some management training, actually for their own mental health as well, because people say, I don't know what I'm doing, and I would quite like to. So it's not a bad thing, and it might move the dial on the culture slightly, but as you quite rightly say, structurally, I mean, you know, the article we wrote on bullying, we basically concluded that it wasn't some kind of incidental fact that 95% of people in the industry had either been bullied or witnessed it. It wasn't like an accident. It's already much hardwired into the system. So,
yeah. Really interesting. And actually, this whole topic is interesting, and you've got some interesting papers I've seen in your link as well. And maybe you'd like to come back and present one of your other papers, for instance, the bullying paper.
happy to, if people want to hear about the joys of bullying in television. Yeah. Yes, it is a bit depressing when you conclude, and yeah, thank you for picking up on that. You know, it is, but when you come to the conclusion that this is structural and cultural at an absolutely fundamental level, and yeah, that it would be useful to do a bit of this and a bit of that, but this and that, it's not going to solve it because it's so fundamental. And that is a slightly depressing conclusion, isn't it? Because that's much harder to do anything about.
Absolutely. Any more questions or comments?
Just some thoughts. No.
Right. So, Vivian, would you like to close?
Okay. It was really very interesting. We really learned about what is going on in the sector, and there were many things that we have discussed about management, about skills, about the people, and the way they see their work and the difficulties they have. And I think the suggestion that Caroline made about having another paper of yours, a presentation and discussion about it would be very insightful to continue this discussion, and probably to compare it also with other sectors, which is really very interesting to have the comparative also analysis, and to see what's going on and what are the effects of crisis on work and people's lives, workers' lives. So we thank you very much. It was really fascinating and insightful, and the discussion was really rich and enlightening. And we hope to see you again in another occasion.
Okay, well, that'd be lovely. And thank you for having me, I guess.
Let's stop the recording.